Alright, so welcome. We'll be doing a quick review on the recent Ric Flair ESPN documentary, 30 for 30. It's ESPN, this is one of their good series, better series. It's pretty much all they have left these days. This was an interesting documentary. I mean, if you're a Ric Flair fan, if you're a wrestling fan, it's worth the watch. Did I learn anything new from it? No, I not really. I didn't really learn anything new from it. I've known, I followed Ric Flair since the '80s. I've heard and read old stories about him and in the ring, out the ring. So this is pretty much, they told the story with Ric Flair. It was a sit-down interview. Well, it was like a confessional booth. You know, they asked him tough questions about his family, about mistakes that he's made. They tried to separate the wrestler Ric Flair from the man Ric Flair, Richard Flair. They touched on his family. They glorified him. You know, he deserves all the praise he can get. I mean, listen, in the '80s, it was Ric Flair in the NWA, WCW, and then there was Hulk Hogan in WWF. If you, going back to the '80s, Hulk Hogan used to get a bad rap outside of WWF, now WWE. Let's put it in today's terms. The hardcore wrestling fans didn't like the Hulk Hogan character too much. He was a cartoon character, a hero, didn't really wrestle great. But then you had Ric Flair, who was not in the WWF. He was the consummate wrestler. He always had great matches. He was famous for his 1-hour draws. But let's stick to the documentary real fast. Of course, they talked about his upbringing. He was adopted by a doctor. His adopted father was a doctor. And he was already a screw up. They talked about how he tried to buy liquor with a fake ID, and then how he went to college, and he was the ultimate frat boy, and he got kicked out he quit college, and then that's how he went and became a wrestler. He actually wrestled in college. He was wrestled, and then he was on the track team. And he tried his hand at wrestling, and this is what I did learn. One thing I did learn is the training that was involved. So he gets trained by Verne Gagne. If you guys, anybody young listening to this, go research Verne Gagne. Verne Gagne was a big-time wrestler in the 50s and the 60s. He's a legit tough guy from all the stories I hear. And then he made his fame when he ran the AWA, which in the 80s, the late 70s and 80s, was the third big promotion in America, in the United States. It was the WWF, WWE in the Northeast. You had the NWA and WCW, which was in the South, and pretty much all over the country when it was still the NWA. And you had the AWA, which was in the central states. Mostly it was located, the headquarters was Minnesota. And you can see here, Ricky Steamboat was in this. This was about, I believe, 1974. And the grueling training that Ricky Steamboat and Ric Flair talked about, they had him running up and down the stairs, And then he had them do a fireman's carry where one wrestler would carry the other one up the stairs. That is grueling. I just want to show you the visuals. I can't play the documentary because YouTube will automatically hit me with a flag. It's not worth it. But this is the fireman's carry, and Ricky Steamboat. He's talking about 21 flights of stairs, and then they do this. If you notice, they do a wheelbarrow where one guy grabs the other one by the ankles, and the man on the bottom climbs the stairs with his arms. And he talks about how so many times they would collapse, their arms would collapse in agony, and they would hit their faces and against the stairs, and they would get black eyes and bruises and cuts. This is grueling, but this is what it takes to become a professional wrestler, and especially back in the day, this was no joke. To be a professional wrestler was no joke. You have to. Anybody will tell you who's trained in wrestling, who's been properly trained in wrestling. I remember stories about Bill Goldberg in WCW when he trained at the power plant in WCW. He would say that it was the hardest thing he ever did. It was much harder than NFL workouts. It's grueling process. So then there's the other piece that I learned about from the documentary. Ric Flair, he wanted to quit. It was too hard for him. I mean, Verne Gagne took him out in the back, and Ric Flair says he slapped him. He slapped him across the face, and Verne Gagne told him, "You're not quitting." So Ric Flair got back in the car, and he finished the training, and they say that's because Verne Gagne could see the talent in Ric Flair. So then they move on. They talk about how Ric Flair, he didn't hit his stride at first. He didn't find his character at first. You could see they say he actually weighed 300 pounds. And this is how he looked before the Ric Flair that we were all used to. Of course, they covered the plane crash that Ric Flair was in, and he survived. He had crushed vertebrae. And it's amazing if you think about it, how he actually went on to perform for another 30 years with this injury. So then they talk about how he started to find his character, and basically he admits he wanted to, he was a rip-off. Well, I wouldn't say rip-off, listen, a lot of wrestlers, they're influenced by other wrestlers from the past, the generation before them. He says he emulated Buddy Rogers, the Nature Boy, Buddy Rogers, that's what he got his name for, only he took it more over the top. You can't, there's no really, you can't really fault, you can't really say anything bad about this. I mean, every wrestler has, or not every wrestler, but there's so many wrestlers have been influenced by other wrestlers. The knock on Hulk Hogan, we got to talk about him again. The knock against him was that he stole his look from superstar Billy Graham with the 24-inch pythons and the mustache, and it's okay. It's like music if you think about it. Bands, rappers who were influenced by their predecessors, and they take things from them and they make it better or heighten them. Then moving quickly along, they do talk about his best rivalries, beginning with Dusty Rhodes. This was the perfect rivalry because Ric Flair was all about the flash, all about the bling, and Dusty Rhodes' character was that he was the son of a plumber. He's the common man, so that was a great feud. They had great chemistry together. The two were probably two of the greatest promo men in the history of wrestling. Fantastic. So as we move on along, they talk about all his successes in the 80s, how he rose to fame, how without the WWF, WWE machine behind him, he became very famous without the WWF machine. Even back then, the WWF machine was huge. I remember when I was a kid how my first glimpses of Ric Flair. I remember there was a store around the corner from me, and they used to have the wrestling magazines, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, Wrestling Insider, and all that. And I would just go in there. I was about maybe 8 years old, 9 years old, and I would go in there and I would read every month. I didn't have the money to buy the magazine. They were like $5 way back then. That's a lot of money. It was a lot of money back then. I would read about Ric Flair, and I would see all the different title compared to WWF. Because back then, we only got here I'm in New York. We only got WWF on Saturdays, and then around 85, 86, they started putting AWA on also on Saturdays. But this is before cable, so this is back in the territory. So if you lived in the Northeast, you would never get to see NWA or WCW or any other territories besides that fact. So after we get past all that, the glitz and the glamour, his rise to fame, then the documentary sort of takes this turn. It's into like it's a typical, stereotypical story of the wrestler who had all the fame, and then he gets old, all the mistakes he made. You know, Ric Flair loved to party, loved the women. He would get divorced. He had kids with 2 different wives. They touched on that a lot. It was almost the second half of the documentary was like they were trying to make it a tearjerker. Of course, Ric Flair really broke down when they talked about his deceased son, Reid Flair. Reid Flair was almost kind of like him. Almost, he tried to be like him. How Triple H told the story on this documentary about how they gave Reid Flair a tryout, but his drug test came back positive, and Ric Flair said it was a mistake, and Triple H was like, all right, listen, because it's you, we'll give him another one. And the second one came back worse. He OD'd on heroin, Reid Flair. There's some really good highlights of Charlotte, and there she is. Her real name is Ashley Flair. And this was at WrestleMania, Ric Flair's last match, his retirement match against Shawn Michaels. They focused a lot on that. And then, like I said, they tried to make this a real tearjerker. Listen, the Ric Flair story is a sad one. No matter how you could be a fan of his, it's a sad one because the guy never, with all the money he made, he never saved his money. He's wasted a lot of money on his divorces, his high lifestyle. He's said in this that he's very happy about Charlotte Flair. He's living vicariously through her. Ric Flair should never have been wrestling Shawn Michaels at WrestleMania at this age. He talked about when Triple H talked about when Ric Flair came back and he was in Evolution, how he lost his confidence. He said, listen, and then he had to go to TNA to wrestle more because he didn't save his money. It's a typical sad sack wrestler who hangs around way too long because he didn't save his money. He had a lot of family problems. They try to keep, again, to wrap up, they try to keep separating, the documentary tries to separate between Ric Flair, the wrestler, and Ric Flair, the man, but they would tell you basically, a lot of the people in the documentary, Triple H and Ricky Steamboat, they basically tell you that Ric Flair went so deep into character that he became the Ric Flair that we all see on TV that would cut the promos. And they talk about how he couldn't stay home. Whenever he had 2-3 days off, he would go home. He couldn't stay home. Listen, what we see on TV and the real people behind the characters, so that's pretty much it.